So Nietzsche, you know, when he packed a lot of information into a sentence or a paragraph, you have to be very careful reading him. And Jung is like this too, because he'll throw some information at you that's packed into a paragraph, and it'll be the kind of information that disrupts high-level structures. You won't even notice it, and it's because he's so subversive. And he wanted to do that. It was an aim of his. He had his reasons to do it. He would say that you have to be broken down to nothing before you can be rebuilt. So it's like a trip to the underworld thing. So, and I suppose in many ways that's what philosophy is. You know, you don't learn a new principle without allowing old principles to disappear, because you can't have the new principle and the old principle at the same time. So almost always any radical learning involves the destruction of old habits and of action and perception. And that's a kind of death. Like it's an abstract death, you know. But that doesn't make it not painful. And the thing is, if the abstract death is of sufficient intensity, it can drive people to suicide, because they regard killing themselves as easier than making the reparation, you know, facing the anxiety and the suffering and going through the intolerably difficult task of retooling. They may well regard that as more emotionally threatening than death. And so, and that's not that rare, you know. I mean, suicide is rare, but it's not that rare. So, you know, and it's certainly a behavior that everyone is, I suspect everyone here has known someone who was touched by suicide in some way. You know, it might not be your family member, even your extended family member, but the probability that you know someone who committed suicide is extremely, extremely likely. So Nietzsche is a very dangerous thinker. The only person I know who kind of approaches him in that regard is Jung. And Jung is actually less troublesome, because a lot of what Dostoevsky offers is destruction. It's intelligent, brilliant destruction, but he doesn't really offer a solution. He sort of sketches out the possibilities of a solution, and he died young. And then, in many ways, what happened was that Jung picked up where Nietzsche left off and tried to solve the problems that Nietzsche left unsolved. So it was Nietzsche, for example, in some sense, along with Dostoevsky, who really definitively announced the death of God at the end of the 19th century. And that left people, in some ways, bereft of belief. And we're going to talk about why that's so important in a moment. What Jung was doing was trying to rescue the father from the underworld, in a sense. He tried to go back to the religious traditions that Nietzsche had described as fatally anachronistic and demolished by the claims of science. He attempted to go back to those religious traditions and reassess them from a psychological perspective, to pull back the necessary meaning that was embedded in them so that people could reunite with their culture and in principle not be so prone to pathological belief systems like ideology that tend to rush in where there's a gap. You know, and Nietzsche said very clearly, and Dostoevsky knew this as well, by the end of the 19th century, is that the death of God would mean that people would turn en masse to rationalistic ideologies, and that would be murderous. They knew that was coming, and that's an amazing prediction. It really is an amazing prediction. It just shows you how thoroughly they understood the structure. Okay, so I'm going to read you something by Nietzsche, and then we're going to return to the hierarchy so that you can kind of understand something deeper about the way the hierarchy is structured. Okay, now he's talking about philosophical ideas here, and he's actually talking about articulated ethics. So one way that you might think about philosophy is that philosophers originate articulated moral principles. And that is often the way that people think about, especially moral philosophy. It's like, it's the philosophers who come up with the ideas. But that isn't what Nietzsche believed. Here's what he said instead. Separate philosophical ideas are not anything optional or autonomously evolving. They grow up in connection and relationship with each other. However suddenly and arbitrarily they seem to appear in the history of thought, they nevertheless belong just as much to a system as the collective members of the fauna of a continent. Okay, so it's a very interesting idea. So the first idea that he's putting forward is that the best way to think about a philosophical system, say a philosophical system of ethics, is as if its different statements are animals related to one another in an ecosystem. So he has a biological metaphor, in some sense, for for the emergence of a philosophical system. It's quite an interesting way of thinking, of course, and it makes sense because if a philosophical system of ethics, which is a philosophical system that tells you how and why you should behave a certain way, is about how you should act, and you're a biological being, then of course it only makes sense that the concepts themselves, which are guides to actions, can logically be considered biological entities. They're abstracted biological entities, but they still have the same nature as biological entities. And that means, according to Nietzsche, that they're subject to the same rules. Now, this is the sort of place where he foreshadows Freud deeply. So, Nietzsche says, they nevertheless belong just as much to a system as the collective members of the fauna of a continent. This is betrayed in the end by the circumstance. However unfailingly, the most diverse philosophers always fill in, again, a definite fundamental scheme of possible philosophies. Under an invisible spell, they always resolve once more in the same orbit, however independent of each other they may feel themselves with their critical or systematic wills. Something within them leads them, something impels them in definite order, the one after the other, to wit, the innate methodology and relationship of their ideas. Their thinking is, in fact, far less a discovery than a re-recognizing, a remembering, a return and a homecoming to a far-off ancient common household of the soul, out of which these ideas formerly grew. Philosophizing is so far a kind of atavism of the highest order. Okay, so here's the idea. There's two fundamental ideas that are embedded in this, which actually Nietzsche differentiates. All right, I'm going to read you another section that illuminates the first one. It gradually became clear to me what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely, the confession of its originator, and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography, and moreover that the moral or immoral purpose in every philosophy has constituted the true vital germ out of which the entire plant has always grown. Okay, so this is a very radical statement, because what Nietzsche is saying is that philosophies, even when they declare themselves rational, are deeply personal, and they're also necessarily embedded within a motivational structure that is either pro-life or anti-life, something like that. So there's no value-free philosophizing. What there is the expression of biologically and culturally conditioned being, which is conditioned by, let's say, the same sort of fundamental forces that Freud described in the biological realm. And then that's conditioned by the cultural processes that we just discussed in relationship to Piaget. And then what the philosopher does is observe that all of those things are happening, allow that to be articulated, and confuse that with his own thought. It's a brilliant idea. Now, here's a way of thinking about it. Now, one of the things Piaget said was that once children start to play games, when they're young, collective games, you can watch the children play the collective games, like maybe 8 kids are playing marbles or something like that. And then you can take the young kids out of the game and you can ask them what the rules are. And what will happen is you'll get a diverse and paradoxical set of articulated rules. And what that means is that the children can play the game when they're in the game and when they're in the context of all the other people, because in some sense the game is embedded in pieces in all of them, and as long as they're all there, that all works. But if you pull the child away, they don't have the intellectual wherewithal to describe the patterns of behavior that make up the game. And that's only to say that they know things that they can't say. Because you might say, well, the rules of the game come first and then the game emerges. But that's wrong. It's the game comes first, and only after that do the rules emerge. And of course, there's a reciprocal relationship between them, because once the rules are somewhat articulated, then the game becomes more structured, and then the rules can become more structured and so on. So the articulation changes the rules. What Nietzsche is saying is that the same thing applies to societies. He says, insofar as you can consider society a collective game played by millions of people over vast spans of time, it's a game of games in some sense. And it emerged from the bottom up. It emerged out of biological impulses and interpersonal and social interactions conditioning and shaping everyone's behavior and perception. And that happened way before anyone could articulate what those rules were. Now, remember, when Nietzsche was writing, there was no real sense of how old the Earth was, or how old the universe was. I mean, people thought, even the radical people thought maybe in terms of hundreds of thousands of years. You know, now we know that the universe is 14 billion years old, and that the Earth is 4 billion years old, and that life has been plentiful on the Earth for 3.5 billion years, you know. So the historical context within which we've originated has expanded by orders of magnitude since the last 19th century. And so then what you think that means is that the way that our games have been organized stretches impossibly back in time. Now, I already told you, I believe, the story about lobster dominance hierarchies, right? So even lobsters, that's 400 million years ago, lobsters array themselves in a social space, and they regulate each other, and that means the lobsters essentially have a lobster society. And, you know, each lobster has biological predispositions that are quite determined. They're quite, the lobster is quite a deterministic creature. But nonetheless, the way that those biological predispositions manifest themselves is conditioned and shaped by the social surrounding. And so you think, well, lobsters started to play games 400 million years ago, and, you know, as we've taken the tremendously long evolutionary journey across that time, we've been playing social games the whole time. And that means that the way that we interact with each other has evolved, and it's even shaped the way our biology manifests itself, because that's how old culture is. And then out of that, as we became more capable of abstraction, and maybe that's, you know, that's something that really took off probably 7 million years ago, with modern human beings emerging about 150,000 years ago, because we separated from the common ancestor of human beings and chimpanzees about 7 million years ago. You can tell that by doing analysis of genetic differences. So the brain expanded very rapidly after that point, and our culture became more and more conscious and articulated and complex and larger and more technological. You know, so it became, in some ways, more dependent on social norms and less dependent on deterministic biological predispositions. But we've still been doing that for a very long time. There's good evidence that, you know, we started using fire about 2 million years ago. And forgive me if I've told you this already, but, you know, if you look at a human being and you look at a chimpanzee, there's a bunch of things you see that are very different morphologically. The chimp is much shorter, much wider, and way more powerful. So like a normal male chimp is about 6 times as strong as the strongest Olympic athlete. So don't mess with chimps. They'll tear you apart. They're really, really strong and dangerous. So, but the chimp is shaped sort of like this. You know, they have a huge gastrointestinal system, roughly speaking. And the reason for that is mostly what they eat is leaves, and leaves have no caloric content, and so they have to eat immense numbers of leaves, and leaves are hard to digest, so they have to chew them like mad. So the typical chimp sits around 8 hours a day chewing. And then they have this tremendously long gastrointestinal system because it takes that long to extract any nutrients out of leaves. Well, we circumvented that, man, as soon as we invented fire, and fire allowed us to outsource our digestion. Because if you cook most things, vegetables, but more importantly meat, if you cook them, they become much more bioavailable, and it takes much less energy to digest them. So that way you can shrink your gut and grow your brain. And so that's apparently what we did, because here we are, you know, relatively slim, at least compared to chimpanzees. And so fire popped up 2 million years ago. It's a real cultural revolution. But, you know, that's so old, that cultural revolution, that it completely reshaped our bodies. And so this interplay between biology and culture has been going on for an unimaginably long period of time. And it conditions everything we do.